This program is made possible in part by the Maryland and Howard County Arts Councils and the Columbia Festival of the Arts.
Hello, welcome to The Writing Life. I'm Ron Charles, senior editor of the Washington Post Book World. Today I'm talking to Carrie Brown. Carrie is the author of 5 novels and a collection of short stories. Most recently, her new novel, The Rope Walk. Hi, Carrie. Thanks for doing this.
Hello, Ron. I'm delighted to be here.
I wanted to start on a very serious note. September 11th changed so many things about America, and particularly as we continue to see American literature. So many authors have addressed this subject in their novels explicitly and many more implicitly. And it seemed to me as I was reading The Rope Walk that you were addressing that subject in some implicit way. I wondered if you could talk about that.
Oh, I think I was actually very directly for myself. I started thinking about the book during 9/11 when my husband and I were watching a television set along with everybody else in America and probably lots of other people in the world. And we were watching it, and I was very aware of our children also watching it.
Right. How old are they?
They are now 21 and 15 and 12. And so then that was several years ago. I can't do the math that fast. But, and I was aware of being torn between wanting to know what was happening and also not wanting my children to have to be listening to too much of it. But they also were curious, and they had a sort of right to know. And I found myself wrestling with these questions of, well, what is it like actually for a child to grow up in a world that feels perilous, in which these enormous perilous things are happening right at your doorstep? And of course, it's not a question that many American children have ever really had to think about, fortunately. Children all over the world have had to think about it. So I imagined then that I would try and write a novel that asked that question and then tried to answer it. What's it like for children today to grow up being aware of all of these scary things like 9/11? So maybe the novel is an answer to that question in some ways.
What is The Rope Walk? How does it play into this novel?
Well, an actual rope walk, as you probably know, from like maritime history, camp. It's a building where they made rope. So you can go to Williamsburg, I think, and see one of these. I think it's kind of dull, you know, it's just like a long pulley. But the rope walk in the novel is actually a child's birthday party game. I went to a birthday party like this when I was a little kid. I always found birthday parties sort of anxiety-producing events.
Even before you became a mother?
Yes, even before, long before I became a mother. Lots of racing around and party games and, you know, duck, duck, goose, somebody not getting a seat. I went to a birthday party where the parents had constructed this huge spider's web, essentially in their backyard, of all these different colored pieces of string and yarn.
Yes.
And every kid started with one end of the string.
I remember this.
And had to, you remember this?
Yeah.
And you had to wind it up, untangling your way as you went, and at the end you got, you know, some bazooka, bubble gum, or, you know, those bubble things. Everybody wins, and it takes a long time. Everybody has to be cooperative. There's not a lot of shouting. It was the perfect game for me. And there's a rope walk in the novel that the two children, protagonists of the story, construct as a way for their ailing neighbor to literally go hand over hand finding his way through the woods around his home. That's a way to give him a guidepost. So they actually construct it as a kind of guidepost for him.
Nice. I have to say there are there's a lot of caring for people in your novels. There are sick people, there are injured people, there are handicapped people. Mm-hmm. Is there a frustrated doctor, nurse, therapist in you trying to express itself through fiction?
I don't know. I think I'm aware all the time, maybe of my own fragility in the world, and and aware of other people's too. It's sometimes in ways that make me uncomfortable. You know, there's Alice, the main character in this novel, is acutely aware of the loneliness and unhappiness of an adult, the sister of the man who's dying in the novel, and it's an almost telepathic, probably not quite the right word, but kinesthetic awareness she has of this person's unhappiness. And I think for some reason I have always been attuned to that, to the ways in which people are fragile and vulnerable, and also deeply moved often by the degree to which we do take care of each other.
Could you read a passage?
Yes.
From the rope walk?
Yes. I'll read from the very beginning of the novel. This is Alice, is the novel's main character. She's a 10-year-old girl. She's the youngest of 6 children, the only girl, separated from her 5 older brothers by a good many years. Her mother died when she was an infant, and she's been raised by her older brothers in their kind of roughshod way, and by her older father, who's an old-fashioned English professor, Shakespeare scholar in this small town. And he doesn't let her watch television, and he doesn't believe in cell phones, and he's kind of slow to the computer age. So Alice has grown up in this country village in Vermont, and has fallen in love with the natural world around her because that's where she has played. And that when the novel opens, it's the morning of her 10th birthday, and she's sitting in her bedroom windowsill, which is where she likes to sit best, and looking out across the fields and the garden of where she lives, and contemplating the world in front of her. So here's just the first couple of paragraphs of the novel. It was going to be a beautiful day. Alice climbed onto her bedroom windowsill and sat down, wrapping her arms around her legs. Early morning mist hovered in mysterious levels over the lawn below. In the tree branches that inclined near her window, the low sun ignited little white signal fires that flashed at Alice from the velvety spaces between the leaves. It was dark still beneath the ragged hems of the firs at the side of the house, and a cool, musty smell rose from under the old rhododendron bushes. But across the front lawn, downy stripes of sunlight began to unfurl between the long shadows of the trees. Beyond the lawn, and then farther out beyond the low border of the stone wall, fields revealed in the growing light raced away to the wooded horizon. On her windowsill, Alice waited, watching. The full energy of the day, like a parade assembling its drums and cymbals and marching players, lay just out of sight, gathering strength at the edge of the world. Any moment now, the day's brimming cup would spill over the far treetops and flood the hour with light.
It's lovely. Lovely.
Thank you.
It strikes me that several of your novels are set in distinctly small places. But I understand you traveled the world as a child, that you lived in some pretty exotic, sophisticated places, in fact.
I did.
London, Hong Kong?
But I think I always felt most comfortable in small villages.
I was going to ask you about that. How did the traveling the world influence your writing?
I think actually the sense of being homeless or rootless.
But your parents were married?
They were. My parents had a lovely, long marriage. They were devoted to each other. My father worked for IBM and was sent abroad a number of times, both to Europe and to the Far East. But I think I am a nester by nature, as many women are, and some men too. And I think that I was always very busy whenever we moved, making myself at home someplace. And often it was in the smallest places that I felt most at home, because for a child, that was the most easily compassed area. Right. And I spent probably the most formative years of my childhood in a very tiny, tiny village in England, where in my own memory, it feels as though I was sort of turned out of the car the day we arrived, and then 4 years later, somebody whistled, and I came back to the car. I don't remember ever seeing really any adults around. I don't remember really being involved with people at all. But I was outside in this little village with its cast of characters and its fields and its back gardens and its little dramas playing out everywhere. And that was the world that I kind of came of age in.
This is the setting of Lamb and Love?
That's the setting of Lamb and Love, yeah.
When I read it, I thought for sure you'd been raised in England.
Yeah. Well, I was in some ways. But it was just 4 years in this little village.
How old were you?
It was middle school, basically, and the equivalent of the middle school years.
You haven't written yet about Hong Kong?
I have not written about the Far East. The Far East for me was a very, as I think it is for many people, a completely enchanting and also bewildering kind of world. It almost feels too large for me still to focus on it. I've written some about Spain, where my husband and I spent a sabbatical. But I can't quite go near Hong Kong yet. I loved Shirley Hazard's novel, The Great Fire. Have you read that?
It's gorgeous.
It's just gorgeous.
Yeah.
And it actually gave me courage. I thought, well, here's a way for me to look at this landscape again, because so much of the Hong Kong landscape figures in that novel in many places, and in a very intimate kind of way.
Right. We learned talking on the phone that we both have older children, teenagers. Your daughter might be older now, who have special needs. I know that's affected the way I respond to the portrayal of people in fiction and movies with special needs. And it's not that there's any overt prejudice against them nowadays, but there's a kind of creepy sentimentality that I can't stand.
Yeah.
And I wonder how the experience with your family has affected the way you write about people with special needs. I know there's a character in Lamb and Love that I think was just perfectly handled.
Yeah, Manfred is the mentally retarded son of the one of the characters in the story, and Manfred is really one of the main characters in the novel.
Right.
I mean, I think because my adult life as a parent, as yours has too, has surrounded me with people with disabilities. If you spend enough time in the medical community with a child who has certain kinds of medical needs, those are the people you come to know, and those, and they're just like anybody else, in that they have personalities and characteristics, and yet those relationships are profound. The caretaking relationship is a profound relationship, and for many people, I think it doesn't happen when they're adults, other than when they're parents themselves, or when they have to take care of their own aging parents.
Right.
You know, usually your child grows out of that stage of intense need and grows up and grows away from your care. But if you have a disabled child, that child is there, present with you for a long time. So I think it's because it's been so much a part of my own experience, those kinds of relationships are present over and over again in my novels.
Right. What gave you the courage to make Manfred funny? Because he is sometimes.
He is sometimes funny. Well, disabled people can be funny.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
Intentionally and unintentionally.
Right.
I think it's been interesting to watch our daughter, our 15-year-old daughter who has cerebral palsy, as your daughter does as well, learn to navigate her social relationships with other kids who want instantly either to regard her as a kind of heroine figure because she's struggling to drag herself around in the world, or to not see her at all.
Yes.
Because they don't know how to respond to her. And she's had to really figure out how to make other people see her, literally see her. We often have people who will come up to us when we're with Molly, who's in her wheelchair, and say to us, "Can she speak?" As if, because, and it's not they're not trying to be cruel.
No.
But that the wheelchair and the presence of some kind of infirmity is deeply troubling to them.
Right.
And they don't know how to approach her.
Right.
But she's quite wickedly funny, and quite wickedly funny about being disabled sometimes.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. I once read that you wanted to create, quote, the pleasure of recognition in your fiction. Remember that phrase? The pleasure of recognition of, you said, empathy, goodness, and light. In these cynical times, how do you get away with saying something like that?
It's pretty icky sounding,
and,
isn't it?
and doing it successfully in your books.
I think I have always believed that literature has a kind of moral component to it, that just by virtue of what it asks of a reader, that it asks you to experience the world through somebody else's eyes,
Right.
that it creates the opportunity and often the experience, unwitting perhaps, of empathy. And that, that in that regard, everything we read and everything we write takes place on a kind of moral canvas.
Mm-hmm.
I think that actually writing about the struggle to be good, the struggle to be heroic, is in some ways not all that different a task than writing about people's failures or weaknesses. That in some ways it's the same, it's just a different side of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
So while it may appear more fashionable today, more au courant, to be writing about the ways in which people dispose themselves badly in the world
Yes.
through their weakness, that examining the ways in which people try to dispose themselves well is an equally valid and in some senses not all that different a task.
Children do that more naturally, I think, more selflessly,
Yeah,
without so much self-consciousness.
yeah,
Alice does it.
yeah.
Yeah. You've written a historical novel, too.
I have.
The Hatbox Baby?
The Hatbox Baby is set in 1933 at the Century of Progress Expo, the real Century of Progress Expo.
In Chicago?
In Chicago, which was a very strange fair. It was the fair of the Depression.
Is it a World's Fair?
It was a World's Fair,
Okay.
yeah. And it was the fair for which nobody had any money. So the whole thing was kind of a chimera. It was all pasteboard. I mean, there are lots of World's Fairs that we're still walking around them today.
Yeah.
The St. Louis Zoo
Right.
was a World's Fair. But the 1933 Expo was, it was just smoke and mirrors. And electricity, they'd finally figured out electricity by then. So it was a big light show. Anyway, the novel is the story of, it's based on the life of a real man, a doctor on Coney Island, who was an early neonatologist. And he was a real figure. He had a hospital on Coney Island, and he would take in babies. Babies were brought to him in, egg cartons and ice cream boxes, tiny little brand new neonates, early babies. And then to make money to fund this hospital, because he never charged for his care, he would take his charges on tour to World's Fairs around the country and the world.
Show the babies to curious gawkers.
Yes, and they did. They paid up, and people loved it. It was one of the most popular. In fact, in 1933, the Incubator Baby exhibit and the Fan Dancer were the two best-selling exhibits at the 1933 fair.
That's so bizarre.
Yeah, he was a really interesting man, very complicated man.
Now, this is the only historical novel you've written?
Yes.
I know there are historical elements to confinement.
Yes, there are. But yes, it's the only novel that takes place well outside of the range of my own lifetime.
You know Henry James' famous condemnation. He's writing to Sarah Jewett, and he says, "The historical novel is, for me, condemned to a fatal cheapness." How did you confront? I mean, there are special problems in writing a historical novel.
Yeah,
How did you
there are.
confront those? Particularly with a kind of ghoulish subject like this, displaying neonatal babies for profit.
Well, of course, there are wonderful, wonderful historical novelists writing today. I think about Thomas Mallon.
I think we're in a real high point for
There
historical
are,
novels.
yes. And I think also that the doors have opened for American readers to so much international literature has also been great, because those are writers who are looking back at a much deeper history often than we have available to us here. I think the problem is really chiefly one of verisimilitude and perspective, and really those are problems that face a novelist regardless of what they're writing about.
Right.
You have to try and make a period of time that we can no longer see around us, we can no longer see the artifacts of it around us, believable, credible, persuasive.
People have to think as they might have thought.
They have to think as they
Speak
might have
that
thought.
way.
So you need to be educated.
Right.
I've tried for years to write a novel, unsuccessfully, based on the astronomer William Herschel. Anyway, he was early 1800s. He
American?
discovered, no, British,
Okay.
well, sort of German-Dutch,
Okay.
and became British. He was the one who discovered Uranus. His son, Sir John Herschel, was also a famous astronomer. I've tried to write for years about this, the older one, William, and his sister.
And what's keeping it from working?
I can't figure out the science.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's a problem of a historical novel.
Right.
I can't both wrap my mind around what they knew then and what we know now.
It doesn't sound
It's
as
too
complicated
much.
as early neonatal medicine, though.
It is.
It is. Okay.
Yeah, parallax is just one of those terms that just knocks me off my chair over and over again. For years, I subscribed to Astronomy Today.
Oh.
I spent all this time with patient grad students at the University of Virginia up in the observatory trying to figure it out, and clearly I'm just never going to get it. So I've had to drop the whole idea, even though I love the dynamic between this guy and his sister, who was really his kind of amanuensis. She would feed him when he was sitting up all night long at his telescope, put food in his mouth, and I mean, it was a fascinating relationship. But I can't figure out the science.
How did you learn the medicine for the Hatbox Baby?
Well, one of our children, our daughter who's disabled, was a preemie.
So you were
born prematurely. So we spent 3 months in a neonatal intensive care unit with her. I didn't write the novel for many months afterward. In fact, I didn't imagine at the time.
Right.
I'd never written a novel then, in fact. She's now 15, so I was still working as a journalist
But
then.
that wasn't your first novel?
It was not my first novel, no. But I wrote, I mean, at the time that she was in the NICU, I had not written a novel yet.
Right.
I was still working as a journalist.
Okay.
So it wasn't until years later that I kind of returned to the NICU. And actually, a lot had happened in the NICU in the 10 years between our daughter's birth and when I went back to see what was happening in them today, just to make sure I had my facts straight.
But you decided to place it much further.
Yeah. Well, mostly because I became so fascinated by this character. There was a photograph of him in one of these helpful books about how to survive having a premature baby. Yeah. It was a history of neonatal medicine, and it showed a picture of this guy, I think at the 1933 fair, buttoned up with his high collar, and his daughter, who had been a preemie but turned out to be about 6 inches taller than her father, a sort of hulking, dark-eyed. She had great dark circles around her eyes, hair parted in the middle, sort of that unfortunate water buffalo hairstyle that women of that age had, standing in front of all their incubators at the fair. And they looked like huge rotisserie ovens with chickens in them. And I looked at the photograph and read the caption, and then I did a little bit of research on him at the time, and I thought, that is one complicated man. And I just never forgot about him.
Yes.
His combination both of being, he was an extraordinary doctor, that he never charged any of his patients, that he believed that he could save these babies that other people were consigning to the fireplace. He was really heroic, but then he could also trot them around and parade them in front of people as though they were not really human or not really entitled to some respect and some dignity, and their families weren't. So his whole mindset was really interesting to me. But it took me a long time to get to the novel.
That's a remarkable subject. I read a lot of first novels that are thinly disguised memoirs of the young author.
Yeah.
And your first novel, The Rose's Garden, is about a 75-year-old man who's just finished a lovely 50-year-old marriage.
Yeah.
What on earth, as a young woman, why did you think, I think I'm going to speak as a 75-year-old man? That's what I want to concentrate on.
Well, my husband teases me that I've always had this thing for old men.
There are a lot of men in your fiction.
There are a lot of old men in my novels. It's true. I mean, I can't explain that.
I was going through the list.
I think I'm attracted to both their wisdom and their vulnerability.
Is your husband much older?
No.
No.
He's in fact younger than I am. So he's kind of teasing me when he says you've always had this thing for old men. I think that for me, a lot of what feels, when I can feel that quickening of interest for me, has to do with, in fact, how far I have to leap from my own life into somebody else's to try and imagine it. And the bigger that leap, the stronger the pull, the stronger the magic somehow. I would find my own life extraordinarily dull to write about. It feels very dull to me. But the imagined life seems much more profitable material.
Interesting, interesting. We know that women read a lot more fiction than men. It's just demographics. Are you a woman's novelist?
Oh, I don't believe so. No, actually. I think, I don't suppose I have any gender
Who is your ideal reader?
preference. I try never to think about that.
You meet them, though, at bookstores. People love
I
your
do,
books.
and they're often women, of course, although there have been some men.
Right.
Particularly Lamb in Love, which is a novel about a sort of middle-aged man's obsession, falling in love with someone for the first time in his life. I had an extraordinary number of letters from men.
I called you.
I remember.
Complete violation of editorial distance.
I remember that
Picked up
you
the
called
phone.
me. You were working at the Christian Science Monitor then.
Picked up the phone,
You could
still
not
crying.
have thrilled me more.
And I said, "I'm sorry. I've just got to reach out to you."
It was really a wonderful phone call.
But you don't think of an ideal reader.
I don't. I really try not to think of them at all. I find, in the same way that reading is part of the pleasure of reading,
Right.
is also the intensely private quality of the experience, which does not mean that it's exclusionary, but that it is something that you yourself are doing with your own self fully invested.
Right.
Writing is the same way for me. Do you know that, I don't know if you ever watch any television. I never watch any except when I'm folding laundry.
The Office.
There you go. Well, there's a commercial, a television commercial. I think it's actually for a car. And it's a guy walking through his nice suburban house in the morning. He's getting dressed, putting on his tie and his coat, and he comes into the kitchen and he kisses his wife goodbye. And she says, "Have a nice day, honey," and hands him his briefcase. And he walks out the front door and walks down the path to his house. And at the very end of the path, he does a free fall off this huge cliff.
Yes.
Right? Is it a car? And then he gets drops into a car.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. For me, writing often feels like that act, that I have literally had to leap out of this physical place that I'm in
Yes.
and free fall into this other universe. And so the bigger that leap is for me, in a way, the more sustaining it is.
That's great. Are you working on another leap right now?
I am working on another leap right now.
You tell us anything about it?
Well, I haven't really quite figured it out yet.
Okay.
It's the story of the relationship actually between a young boy and an older man, a teacher. I'm interested in writing about a teacher right now for some reason.
Well, it's been great to talk to you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed this very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've been speaking with Carrie Brown for The Writing Life. I'm Ron Charles.